The dusty streets of Fort Apache buzzed with nervous energy as word spread through the settlement. Another Apache warrior had been captured during the latest skirmish near the canyon. This time, it wasn't just any warrior. It was a woman, and the soldiers whispered among themselves about her fierce reputation. Captain Morrison stood in his office, studying the telegram that had arrived from headquarters. The Army needed someone reliable to guard this particular prisoner. She wasn't like the others they had dealt with before. Intelligence reports suggested she was connected to several successful raids against supply wagons, and her knowledge of Apache movements made her valuable for interrogation. James Mitchell had been working as a civilian contractor for the fort for nearly 2 years. His job was simple but crucial: guard prisoners and ensure they didn't escape. At 35, he had seen enough of frontier life to understand that survival often meant making difficult choices. The pay was steady, and after losing his farm to drought 3 years earlier, steady work was something he couldn't afford to refuse. When Captain Morrison called him into the office that Tuesday morning, James expected another routine assignment. The captain was a fair man, though hardened by years of frontier warfare. He treated his civilian contractors with respect, understanding that their work was essential to maintaining order in this remote outpost. "Mitchell, I need you for a special assignment," the captain began, his weathered face serious. "We've got a prisoner who requires extra attention. She's Apache, and from what our scouts tell us, she's not going to be cooperative." James nodded, accepting the leather folder the captain extended across his desk. Inside were basic details about the prisoner. Her name was Ayanna, which he learned meant eternal blossom in Apache. She was estimated to be in her mid-20s, captured during a raid on a supply convoy heading to a neighboring settlement. What caught James's attention wasn't just her involvement in the raid, but the fact that she had been leading it. The fort's main holding area consisted of 3 stone cells built into the side of a hill. They were cool in summer and reasonably warm in winter, though hardly comfortable. The cells had been designed to hold male prisoners, with thick wooden doors reinforced with iron bands. Small windows near the ceiling provided the only natural light. When James first saw Ayanna, she was sitting in the corner of her cell, her back straight against the stone wall. Her long black hair had been braided in traditional Apache style, though it was now dusty from travel. Her clothes, a mixture of traditional Apache dress and practical frontier clothing, showed signs of recent conflict. What struck James most was her eyes. They held no trace of defeat or submission. Instead, they burned with an intensity that suggested she was already planning her next move. The fort's interpreter, an older man named Santos, who had lived among various tribes for decades, provided the basic communication between the guards and the prisoner. Through Santos, James learned that Ayanna had initially refused to speak at all. When she finally did communicate, it was only to demand water for drinking and to ask about the fate of her horse, which had been wounded during her capture. James's daily routine became centered around his new responsibility. Every morning at dawn, he would bring her water and the simple meal that all prisoners received, usually bread, sometimes with dried meat or beans. She would watch him carefully during these visits, studying his movements and expressions. He found himself doing the same, trying to understand this woman who had earned such a fearsome reputation among the soldiers. The first week passed without incident. Ayanna seemed to be adjusting to captivity, though James could sense her constant alertness. She exercised within the confines of her cell, maintaining her physical condition. She asked Santos questions about the fort's routines, the number of soldiers, and the frequency of supply deliveries. To most, these might have seemed like idle curiosity, but James recognized them as intelligence gathering. Captain Morrison visited the prisoner regularly, always accompanied by Santos for translation. The interrogations were professional but persistent. The Army wanted information about Apache movements, the locations of camps, and plans for future raids. Ayana's responses were minimal and often contradictory. She seemed to enjoy providing false information, sending search parties in wrong directions. As the second week began, James noticed changes in the prisoner's behavior. She had begun humming traditional songs, low and melodic, during the quiet hours of early morning and late evening. The sound carried through the stone corridors, creating an atmosphere that many of the soldiers found unsettling. For James, however, the music sparked something unexpected: curiosity about the woman behind the warrior reputation. During one of his routine meal deliveries, James found Ayana sitting near the small window, looking up at the patch of sky visible through the opening. She spoke to him in broken English, words she had apparently been learning from Santos during the interrogation sessions. "Your name?" she asked, her pronunciation careful but clear. James hesitated. Fraternizing with prisoners was discouraged, but there seemed no harm in basic courtesy. "James," he replied simply. She nodded, seeming to file the information away. "James," she repeated, testing the sound of it. "You have family?" The question caught him off guard. In all his time guarding prisoners, none had ever asked him anything personal. Most were too focused on their own situations to care about their guards' lives. "No," he answered honestly. "Not anymore." Ayana studied his face with those intense dark eyes. "War takes much," she said quietly, and James understood she wasn't just talking about his personal losses. Over the following days, their brief exchanges became slightly longer. James learned that Ayana had been taught some English by traders who had passed through Apache territory. Her vocabulary was limited, but she was clearly intelligent and picked up new words quickly. She asked about the weather, about the other prisoners, and occasionally about life in the white settlements. James found himself looking forward to these conversations, brief as they were. After 2 years of routine guard duty, dealing mostly with drifters, thieves, and occasionally violent men, talking with Ayana was different. She treated him with a respect that he hadn't expected from a prisoner, particularly one with her reputation. The fort's daily routine continued around them. Soldiers drilled in the courtyard, supply wagons arrived and departed, and the business of maintaining an army outpost in hostile territory went on. But within the stone walls of the detention area, something subtle was shifting in the relationship between guard and prisoner. James began to notice details about Ayana that had nothing to do with security concerns, the way she arranged her few possessions with careful precision, how she saved small portions of bread to feed the birds that occasionally landed on her window ledge, the fact that despite her circumstances, she maintained personal hygiene and dignity with whatever resources were available to her. One evening, as James was completing his final security check of the day, he heard Ayana singing more clearly than before. The melody was haunting and beautiful, unlike anything he had heard from the military bands or the occasional traveling musicians who passed through the fort. When she finished, she called out to him. "James, you listen long time," she said when he approached her cell. He felt slightly embarrassed at being caught. "It's beautiful," he admitted. "What does it mean?" Through a combination of English words and gestures, Ayana explained that it was a song about the wind carrying messages between people who were separated. It was sung by Apache women when their men were away hunting or fighting, a way of sending love and protection across great distances. "You sing for someone far away?" James asked. Ayana's expression grew serious. "I sing for my people, for freedom that flies like eagle, but cannot be caged." Her words carried a weight that made James uncomfortable. He was beginning to understand that holding this woman prisoner was more complicated than he had initially realized. She wasn't just a captured enemy combatant. She was a person with connections, responsibilities, and a deep love for her way of life. As the third week of her imprisonment began, James noticed that Captain Morrison's interrogations were becoming more frequent and more intense. The pressure from higher command for useful intelligence was increasing. Other Apache raids in the territory were becoming bolder, and the Army needed information to plan their responses effectively. James could see the strain these sessions were putting on Ayanna. While she maintained her dignity and resistance, the constant questioning was wearing on her. She had begun eating less, and her songs had become less frequent. The spark in her eyes remained, but James could sense her growing frustration with her situation. It was during this time that James began to question his own role in her imprisonment. Each day, as he brought her meals and ensured her security, he was participating in a system that was slowly breaking down a person he had come to respect. The realization troubled him more than he cared to admit. The fourth week brought unexpected developments that would change everything for both James and Ayanna. Captain Morrison received word that a prisoner exchange might be possible. A prominent white trader captured during a recent Apache raid could potentially be traded for information about future tribal movements. However, the negotiations would take time, and the Army command wanted to ensure their Apache prisoner remained cooperative during the process. James noticed the change in Ayanna immediately when Santos delivered this news during one of the interrogation sessions. For the first time since her capture, he saw something that might have been hope flicker across her face. She asked detailed questions about the proposed exchange, wanting to know who might be involved and when it might happen. Her English had improved significantly during her weeks in captivity, and she no longer needed Santos to translate every conversation. "They say maybe I go home," she told James during his evening meal delivery, "but they want things from me first." James understood the dilemma she faced. Cooperation might mean freedom, but it could also mean betraying her people. The intelligence she possessed could lead to attacks on Apache camps, potentially putting innocent people at risk. It was a choice between personal freedom and loyalty to her tribe. During this time, James began to see beyond the surface of military operations at the fort. He observed how the soldiers talked about the Apache, often using language that reduced an entire people to the status of wild animals. He listened to conversations about raids and casualties, noting how rarely anyone acknowledged that the Apache were fighting for their traditional lands and way of life. These realizations made his job increasingly difficult. Each morning when he unlocked Ayanna's cell to deliver her meal, he felt like he was participating in something fundamentally wrong. She had never tried to escape, never threatened him, and had treated him with more courtesy than many of the soldiers he worked alongside. Yet here he was, keeping her confined against her will. The prisoner exchange negotiations dragged on for nearly 2 weeks. During this time, Ayanna's behavior began to change in subtle ways. She became more withdrawn, spending long hours staring out her small window. Her songs stopped entirely. When James tried to engage her in their usual brief conversations, her responses became shorter and less engaged. James realized she was losing hope. The promised exchange seemed to be stalling, and the interrogations continued with increasing pressure. Captain Morrison had made it clear that without some form of cooperation from Ayanna, the exchange might not happen at all. The Army needed to show their superiors that holding her had produced valuable intelligence. One evening, James arrived to find Ayanna sitting in the corner of her cell, her knees drawn up to her chest. She looked smaller somehow, and for the first time he saw genuine despair in her expression. When she looked up at him, her eyes held a question that she didn't need to voice. How much longer would this continue? "The talks are still happening," James said, though he wasn't sure if that was entirely true. "These things take time." Ayanna nodded, but he could see she didn't really believe it anymore. "James," she said quietly, "you think about your freedom when you were a young man?" The question surprised him. "What do you mean?" "Before work here. When you could go anywhere, do anything. You remember feeling of that freedom?" James thought about it. He remembered being 18, full of dreams about heading west, maybe finding gold or starting a ranch. The world had seemed limitless then, full of possibilities. "Yes," he said, "I remember." "That feeling," Ayanna continued, "is like breathing for my people. Take it away and we die inside even if body still lives." Her words hit James harder than he expected. He had never thought about freedom in such visceral terms. For him, it had always been about choices and opportunities. For Ayanna and her people, it was apparently something much more fundamental, a basic requirement for survival. The next morning brought disturbing news. Santos informed James that the prisoner exchange had fallen through. The Apache negotiators had apparently changed their demands, and the Army command had decided the proposed trade was no longer worth pursuing. Ayanna would remain in custody indefinitely while new options were explored. James knew he would have to tell her, but he dreaded the conversation. When he brought her morning meal, he could see in her eyes that she already suspected something had gone wrong. The hope that had sustained her through the previous weeks was fading. "The exchange?" she asked simply. "Not going to happen," James replied, unable to soften the blow. "At least not now." Ayanna closed her eyes and leaned back against the stone wall. For a long moment, she said nothing. When she finally looked at James again, something had changed in her expression. The spark of resistance was still there, but it was now mixed with something else, a kind of resigned determination. "Then I will die here," she said matter-of-factly. "But I die as Apache." The certainty in her voice shook James. He had seen prisoners lose hope before, but there was something different about Ayanna's response. She wasn't giving up. She was making a choice about how to face an impossible situation. Over the next few days, James watched as Ayanna began what he could only describe as a gradual withdrawal from life itself. She ate less, despite his encouragement. She stopped asking questions about the outside world or showing interest in the daily activities of the fort. Most troubling, she stopped speaking English entirely, communicating only in Apache when absolutely necessary. Santos became concerned about her behavior and reported it to Captain Morrison. The captain ordered the fort's doctor to examine her, but he found no physical illness. "She's healthy in body," the doctor told James. "But something's happening with her spirit." James understood what the doctor couldn't quite articulate. Ayanna was slowly dying from the inside out, not from disease or injury, but from the crushing weight of indefinite captivity. She had faced the possibility of death in battle, the risk of injury, and the hardships of her nomadic life. But being caged, unable to move freely across the land she loved, was destroying something essential in her nature. The realization forced James to confront an uncomfortable truth about his own role in her situation. He was not just a guard doing his job. He was an active participant in what was essentially the slow killing of another human being. The steady paycheck and job security that had once seemed so important now felt meaningless in the face of this reality. During the 6th week of Ayanna's imprisonment, James made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He couldn't continue to be part of her destruction, regardless of the consequences for his own future. The woman who had once led Apache raids and fought for her people's freedom deserved better than to waste away in a stone cell. James began to plan carefully. He studied the routines of the fort, noting which guards were on duty at different times and when the detention area was least monitored. He observed the patrol patterns and the times when the main gate was most likely to be unguarded. Most importantly, he began to consider how he might help Ayanna escape without immediately pointing suspicion toward himself. The plan would require timing, luck, and a willingness to sacrifice everything he had built in his 2 years at the fort. James knew that if he was caught helping a prisoner escape, he would face charges that could result in prison time or worse. But as he watched Ayana growing weaker each day, he realized that some things were more important than personal security. He also began to understand something about himself that he hadn't recognized before. His own sense of freedom had been gradually eroded over the years, not by imprisonment, but by the necessity of making compromises to survive. Helping Ayana escape would be more than just an act of mercy. It would be a way of reclaiming something essential about his own humanity. The opportunity James had been waiting for came during the 7th week of Ayana's imprisonment. A supply convoy was scheduled to arrive during the early morning hours, which would draw most of the fort's attention to the main gate and loading areas. Additionally, 2 of the regular guards had been assigned to escort duties, leaving the detention area with minimal supervision. James knew this might be his only chance. As he prepared for what could be his last day as a guard at Fort Apache, he found himself thinking about the conversation he would need to have with Ayana. Would she trust him enough to follow his plan? And perhaps more importantly, would she have enough strength left to make the attempt? The morning of the escape dawned clear and cold. James arrived at his post earlier than usual, his heart pounding with nervous energy. He had spent most of the previous night refining his plan, considering every possible complication. The supply convoy was due to arrive within 2 hours, and he would need to act quickly once the distraction began. When he approached Ayana's cell for the morning meal delivery, he found her sitting by the window, looking more alert than she had in days. It was as if she sensed that something important was about to happen. Her eyes followed his movements with the sharp attention he remembered from her first days of captivity. "Ayana," James said quietly, setting down the food tray and glancing around to ensure they were alone. "I need to tell you something important." She looked at him with renewed interest, perhaps hearing something different in his voice. "What you say, James?" "I'm going to help you leave here," he said simply. "Today." For a moment, Ayana stared at him without speaking. He could see her mind working, processing this unexpected information. "Why?" she finally asked. "You lose everything if soldiers catch you." James had prepared for this question, but when the moment came to answer it, he found himself speaking from the heart rather than from his rehearsed explanation. "Because watching you die slowly in that cell is killing something in me too. Because you don't deserve this. Because it's the right thing to do." Ayana studied his face for a long moment, looking for any sign of deception or hidden motive. Finally, she nodded slowly. "What must I do?" James outlined his plan quickly but thoroughly. The supply convoy would create chaos and distraction throughout the fort. During the confusion, he would unlock her cell and lead her to a storage area near the rear wall where he had hidden civilian clothes and supplies. From there, she would need to climb over the wall using a rope he had positioned the night before. Once outside, she would find a horse tied in a grove of trees about half a mile north of the fort. "The horse belongs to a trader who left it with us," James explained. "It's not stolen, just borrowed. Once you're far enough away, turn it loose. It will find its way back eventually." Ayana listened carefully to every detail, asking practical questions about timing and routes. Her warrior instincts were reasserting themselves as she contemplated the possibility of freedom. "What happens to you when they discover?" she asked. "I'll figure something out," James replied, though they both knew his options would be limited. "Maybe I can convince them you overpowered me somehow." "James," Ayana said seriously, "you do this thing. You become outlaw like me. You never can go back to old life." He had already considered this harsh reality. Once he helped her escape, he would be forced to leave everything familiar behind. His job, his small room at the fort, the steady income that had allowed him to rebuild after losing his farm, all of it would be gone. "I know," he said simply. The sound of approaching horses and shouting men indicated that the supply convoy had arrived ahead of schedule. James felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with panic. He had planned to have more time to prepare Ayanna mentally for the escape attempt. Now they would have to act immediately or lose the opportunity. "It's time," he said, pulling the cell key from his belt. "Are you ready?" Ayanna stood up with more energy than she had shown in weeks. The prospect of freedom had awakened something in her that captivity had nearly extinguished. "I am ready," she said firmly. James unlocked the cell door with hands that shook slightly from nervous energy. As Ayanna stepped into the corridor for the first time in 7 weeks, she paused for a moment, seeming to savor the simple act of moving freely through an open doorway. They moved quickly through the back corridors of the detention area, avoiding the main passages where other guards might be stationed. The sounds of the convoy's arrival echoed through the fort, horses neighing, men shouting orders, wagons creaking as they were maneuvered into position. The commotion was even louder than James had hoped, which would help mask any sounds they might make. The storage room James had chosen was located near the fort's rear wall, away from the main activity. Inside, he had hidden a simple dress, worn boots, and a shawl that would help Ayanna blend in with civilian travelers once she was outside the fort. The clothes belonged to the wife of one of the officers, borrowed from laundry that James had volunteered to deliver. Ayanna changed quickly, her movements efficient and purposeful. The transformation was remarkable. In her Apache clothing, she had looked like a captured warrior. In the simple frontier dress, she appeared to be just another woman traveling through difficult territory. "The rope is behind those grain sacks," James instructed, pointing to the rear corner of the storage room. "The wall is about 8 feet high at that point. Can you manage it?" "I climb higher mountains than wall," Ayanna replied with the first trace of humor she had shown in weeks. As they prepared for the most dangerous part of the escape, James found himself thinking about what would happen after Ayanna was gone. The discovery of her escape would trigger a massive search effort. Soldiers would fan out in all directions, questioning everyone and searching every possible hiding place. His own role would come under intense scrutiny. But as he watched Ayanna prepare to reclaim her freedom, James knew he was making the right choice. Some decisions couldn't be measured in terms of personal cost and benefit. Some situations required a person to act based on deeper principles, regardless of the consequences. Ayanna moved the grain sacks and located the rope James had hidden. She tested its strength with a few sharp tugs, then looked up at the section of wall she would need to climb. The top was lined with sharpened wooden stakes, but James had created a gap between 2 of them that would allow her to pass through safely. "Once you're over the wall, head north toward those cottonwood trees," James reminded her. "The horse is a bay mare, gentle but strong. She'll carry you far if you treat her well." Ayanna turned to face James before beginning her climb. For a moment, they looked at each other across the cultural and personal divides that had defined their relationship. Guard and prisoner, white and Apache, man and woman. All those distinctions seemed less important now than the human connection they had forged during her weeks of captivity. "James," she said quietly, "what you do for me, it changes my heart about some white people. I will remember." "Just remember to stay alive and stay free," James replied. "That's all the thanks I need." Ayanna began climbing the rope with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to difficult terrain. Despite her weeks of confinement, her strength and coordination returned quickly as her body remembered its natural capabilities. Within minutes, she had reached the top of the wall and was carefully maneuvering through the gap James had created between the wooden stakes. As she prepared to drop down the other side, Ayanna paused and looked back at James. She raised her hand in a gesture of farewell that somehow conveyed both gratitude and blessing. Then she disappeared over the wall, leaving James alone in the storage room with the evidence of what they had done together. James quickly rearranged the grain sacks to hide the rope and made sure no obvious signs of the escape remained visible. He would need to return to his normal duties and act as if nothing unusual had happened. The success of Ayana's escape would depend partly on how long it took for someone to discover her empty cell. When James emerged from the storage room and walked toward the main area of the fort, he found the chaos of the supply convoy's arrival even more intense than he had expected. 2 wagons had gotten stuck in the muddy area near the main gate, and soldiers were working to free them while unloading supplies from the other vehicles. The distraction was perfect for covering Ayana's escape. Captain Morrison appeared from his office, surveying the confusion with obvious irritation. "Mitchell," he called when he spotted James. "Where have you been? I need you to help coordinate the unloading." "Yes, sir," James replied, falling into step beside the captain. "Just finished checking on the prisoners." "How's our Apache doing? Any change in her attitude?" James felt his heart rate increase, but he managed to keep his voice steady. "No change, sir. Still not very communicative." It would be at least 2 hours before anyone thought to check on Ayana again. By that time, she should be miles away from the fort, riding hard toward Apache territory and freedom. James found himself silently urging her to push the horse as fast as it could travel safely. The morning passed in a blur of activity as James helped supervise the unloading and storage of supplies. He performed his duties automatically, his mind focused on calculating how far Ayana might have traveled and whether she had encountered any patrols. Every few minutes, he glanced toward the hills north of the fort, wondering if she was already beyond the range of immediate pursuit. When the lunch hour arrived, James knew the discovery of the escape was imminent. Someone would bring Ayana her midday meal and find the empty cell. He positioned himself near the detention area, wanting to be present when the alarm was raised so he could react appropriately. The shout came from Corporal Stevens, a young soldier who had drawn meal duty for the prisoners. "Captain Morrison." "Sir, the Apache woman is gone." Within minutes, the fort erupted into organized chaos. Soldiers ran to their stations, preparing for a massive search operation. Captain Morrison strode toward the detention area with several officers, his face grim with anger and concern. James followed, doing his best to appear shocked and confused like everyone else. The empty cell told its own story. The door stood open, and Ayana's few possessions had been left behind. Captain Morrison examined the cell carefully, looking for any clues about how the escape had been accomplished. "How long since anyone checked on her?" he demanded. "I saw her this morning around 6, James volunteered. "She seemed normal then." "The lock wasn't forced," one of the officers observed. "Someone used a key." Captain Morrison's eyes narrowed as he considered the implications. "Round up everyone who has access to these keys. I want them questioned immediately. And get search parties ready. She can't have gotten far on foot." As James watched the investigation begin, he felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. Ayana had been free for nearly 6 hours now. If his plan had worked correctly, she should be well beyond the immediate search area. But the discovery of the unlocked cell would focus attention on the guards and anyone else with access to the detention area. The questioning began within an hour. Each person with key access was interviewed separately by Captain Morrison and his senior officers. When James's turn came, he stuck to his prepared story. He had seen Ayana during his morning rounds, delivered her meal, and locked the cell securely. He had noticed nothing unusual about her behavior or attitude. "Where were you between 6 this morning and noon?" Captain Morrison asked. "Mostly helping with the supply convoy," James replied truthfully. "You assigned me to coordinate the unloading. Anyone can verify that?" "Several soldiers saw me working on the wagons. Corporal Jenkins, Private Martinez, others." Captain Morrison made notes, but seemed satisfied with James's responses. The investigation would continue, but for the moment James appeared to be above suspicion. As the day wore on, search parties returned with no trace of Ayana. The soldiers had found the horse missing from the grove north of the fort, which suggested she had indeed headed in that direction. But the trail had gone cold after a few miles, lost in rocky terrain that left no clear tracks. That evening, as James completed his duties and prepared to return to his quarters, he allowed himself to believe that Ayanna had successfully escaped. She was free, riding through the land she loved, breathing the air of liberation that had been denied to her for 7 terrible weeks. Standing outside his small room at the fort, James looked up at the stars and wondered what the future would hold for both of them. Ayanna would return to her people, carrying with her a story of captivity and unexpected kindness. For James, life would continue at the fort, but with the knowledge that he had done something meaningful and right, regardless of the risks. The investigation would go on for several more days, but eventually, the army would have to accept that their prisoner had simply vanished. James's secret would remain safe, and Ayanna's freedom would become just another story in the ongoing conflict between two very different ways of life. But for James Mitchell, the man they had employed to keep an Apache under guard, the day he chose to let her go would remain the most important decision of his life. A moment when he discovered that sometimes the right choice requires abandoning everything you thought you wanted in favor of something far more valuable, the chance to affirm another person's fundamental right to be free.